I'm Nicola Talent, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com. So Scott Kapper, an enforcer, he's described as an enforcer for the Flashy gang. Of course, we have recently named Flashy as Glenn Ward, who is serving a prison sentence. Kapper is 37 and has a string of convictions, is constantly finding himself before the courts or in disciplinary problems in prison. And we're going to talk about some of the more recent cases he's been involved in. But really, Kapper has been around since Flashy became Flashy, since before that, when they were called the Gucci Gang, since the Gucci Gang were probably under the tutelage of Trevor Byrne. And if he looks back to his younger days and his circle of friends, he probably sees a lot of faces are gone, missing. And they've either been shot dead or they've died through addiction issues or other things like that. So 37 years old. He is a twin, is he not, Scott Kapper?
But he has a brother, Mark Kapper, who at one point was...
but he had a twin sister.
He does have a twin sister, sorry. And he has a brother, Mark Kapper, who came before the courts in relation to a botched hit on Patsy Hutch, which he'd actually backed out of, but he was prosecuted in relation to it.
And which one was that? Was that the one where Patrick Curtis, etc., were caught up in, or was it a separate hit?
Yeah,
where there was the big hit team were found in an underground car park. Exactly. He had been included. I remember now. He had been there and he backed out of it because he kind of felt.
Well, it was.
He felt there was he could smell a rat. Basically, there was something uncomfortable for him.
Yes. Now, Scott Kapper, of course, would have grown up as part of, I suppose, what was called the Gucci Gang. And
who'd be based in an area of Dublin called Coolock, which is in the north side, and which has been heavily associated with organised crime, really because of certain individuals who would have been significant in the Kinahan grouping as they made their way up.
Yeah, so what happened, I suppose, with the Gucci Gang is they had this rapid rise to power. And they really challenged the old order at a very, very young age. They were guys in their early 20s, people like Glenn Ward and Sean Little in particular, who had very good connections into the Kinahan organisation. Sean Little in particular through the sort of Byrne organised crime end of it, and Glenn Ward ultimately through Ross Browning, described recently by Cab as the number one Kinahan figure in the country at the time. And
he was his connection initially, was he?
He was Glenn Ward's connection.
Because Glenn Ward ended up under the tutelage of Trevor Byrne.
He did, but I suppose once Trevor Byrne which he was quickly out of the picture once the feud began, Ross Browning stayed in Dublin, unlike the rest of them, and Glenn Ward really had his rapid ascent through that. So while they were ascending, there already was an older groups of criminals based in Finglas area, some of them very well established. In particular, guys like David Sauce Mulvey, who had served, serious prison time and had been, in one occasion, been convicted in relation to a shooting with Bottler Devoy. And Scott Kapper first hit the papers because there had been a row in the pub between Mulvey and a group of his associates and what members of the Flashy entourage, I suppose. Now,
they'd be the Guccis then, were they?
They would be the Guccis, yeah. Well, I mean, there are, and of course,
they're both silly names. But
well, I mean, actually, if you look back in the Cab case brought against Sean Little, they are initially described as being in the one organisation and described as the Gucci Gang, but Flashy kind of went off on his own direction, I suppose. But anyway, Kapper was involved in this really violent clash in a pub with these older established criminals like David Sauce Mulvey. And I remember people talking to me at the time and saying, Jesus, like, they're really young to be taken on what are like heavy characters.
Just go back and explain that for a second about the Gucci gang and then the Flashy Mob, because the Gucci gang also was headed up by Ward, yeah?
Well, I mean,
or was he just part of it? Did he take over and then it became the Flashy Mob, essentially?
Well,
I know they're both just nicknames that were used by the media to try and describe them before they really had racked up serious convictions and they couldn't be named. And it was also easier when you're trying to talk about groupings in particular areas. If you give the gang a nickname, at least then people kind of have an idea that you're talking about this crowd as opposed to the other crowd. But the Gucci gang sort of are very young, I think, when the Kinahans are in power.
Yeah.
But you still have Glenn Ward and you still have the likes of Scott Kapper there. You have others that, as we spoke about, have been murdered, but they're all in their kind of young early 20s.
Yeah.
Kapper's older than them.
Well, he's only a few years older, so he's 37 now. So if you look back to the beginning of the feud, which is exactly 10 years ago, he's
27,
he's
yeah.
26,
Some of the others are 22, 23.
They're slightly younger. And, they are, you can see them if you go back far enough in social media. They're all socialising together.
Yeah.
They're all hanging around together. Now, at some point, things become a bit more distinct. And certainly Sean Little and some of his associates are really working in the Coolock area, and Flashy goes on to really dominate.
And what you're saying is Sean Little and his associates sort of become the Gucci grouping
they take on that moniker.
They take on that moniker while Glenn Ward goes off a little bit on the side. And we see, of course, when Sean Little himself is murdered, and there's a spree of murders around this time. His friend Zach Parker is killed in 2019, in the January of 2019, outside of Jimmy, shot dead in a Jeep. Little known kind of criminal at that stage, very young. I think he's only 19 or 20 when he's killed. He has a few bob in a bank account, maybe about 20,000. He's a Rolex on his arm, and he likes to wear sort of Montclair and brands like that. And he likes to go on holiday. So he's killed. Sean Little sort of is chief mourner at his funeral, but will find himself dead and staring down the barrel of a gun himself at the side of a road not long after that. Is it a year? It's certainly within the year. And he's shot dead. And in the middle of it, they're hanging around with this older guy called Hamid Sanambar, who's an Iranian who's been in the country for years and years, but at the time, who's rumoured to be a sort of an assassin trained in beheading and having been sent in by Daniel Kinahan as his personal hitman. He's nothing of the sort. He's just a bit of a kind of a spoofer who's very old and hanging around as a protector of these younger guys. He's shot dead in the garden of Sean Little's home during his wake. And in the aftermath of that, Owen Boylan is shot dead, and others. There's a spree of about 6 murders.
Yeah, and of course Glenn Ward attends a number of these funerals, including famously being pictured in a kind of a limo, I think, on the way to...
He was videoed in a limo on the way to Sean Little's funeral.
Exactly. And so there is this huge crossover between these organisations. But I suppose that fight in 2017 in the pub in Finglas shows how at that point Kapper's involved in this. There's a big brawl in a pub, which includes David Sauce Mulvey, and there's numbers of violent incidents in the aftermath. Kapper was ultimately sentenced to 9 months for that. But I suppose it shows that at that point, that gang, the Flashy organisation, had been able to challenge people that had been heavily involved in organised crime for a long, long time. Trevor Byrne, as you said, had left, and they had been just making a load of money. This vacuum was created. Now, Kapper, he was, I suppose people would say he was quite a sort of charming character, actually. Somebody said, recently said in the office, he's quite handsome, isn't he, when he was convicted. And he'd been a really talented footballer by all accounts that had gone on and had trials with a number of clubs in England. That was all said in court. But despite all of that, he has just continued to get involved.
Trouble. And really, the Gucci gang is pretty much wiped out. by that series of murders.
And the flashy organisation.
And the flashy mob
totally
has been totally... Because the flashy mob became so troublesome within its own community for a long time that I think there was a huge amount of Garda resources put into dismantling it. And of course, the jailing of Glenn Ward and others has done exactly that.
Yeah.
But Kapper behind bars, and despite the fact that he's heading to his 40th year on earth, is continuing to find and cause trouble.
And whenever he gets out, in the times he gets out, because he received relatively lengthy sentences, some of them for serious enough offences. But this is an interesting case he was involved in last November, right? So he was found covered in cocaine when the Gardaí caught him fleeing from a car. And he'd been driving at speeds across the suburbs of Sutton, Holt and Baldoyle. There had been a multi-vehicle chase. So that means the guards get called. They start chasing him around. He drove at speed at the Garda cars, forcing the driver to take evasive action. At some point, he got out of the car to run away. And he'd obviously had loads of little bags of cocaine. And he started throwing them into the air.
Right.
But I think he must have either caught a bad wind or whatever. So
he ended up covered in it, basically.
He ended up covered with it and was arrested. He was, according to his own defence, covered in cocaine when they found him. And the estimated street value of the drugs was 5,700.
He was covered in €5,700 worth of cocaine. Wow.
Doesn't say specifically, but...
He must have been white as a ghost.
And, again, they describe him as he was unfit for interview after his arrest, but he was uncooperative until he sobered up.
Yeah, dangerous driving a car like that at high speed.
It's absolutely crazy.
Chaotic. So he got 27-month sentence in relation to that, yeah?
Yes. He's been back before the courts on a more serious charge where he's pled guilty to assault causing harm in Mountjoy. But he had a more serious charge of violent disorder dropped. And that charge the initial charge had been violent disorder arising from a gang attack on a guy called Robert O'Connor in 2022 in prison. Now, Robert O'Connor ultimately died as a result of that attack. Kapper had been charged with a sort of lesser role than the actual attack, but ultimately that case was dropped and a null prosequi was entered by the state. So he still faced a serious charge, but it's not in connection with the death of that prisoner, which was a very tragic.
So where are we with him at this point? He's pleaded guilty in relation to the lesser offence as regards that, but he's serving 27 months for the spillage of the cocaine and the high-speed chase, which he got in last year?
He got last November. He got the sentence maybe
November.
Backdated.
Okay.
Sorry, November, yeah.
Yeah.
And now he's come before the courts in connection with a phone.
And we can see in these cases and in other people we talk about that keep repeatedly coming before the courts, that have racked up double figures with their previous convictions, who are showing that they're not learning from their mistakes and they're continuing in this sort of life of criminality, even if it is sort of what would be seen as being lesser offences.
Yeah.
They're getting quite hefty sentences in relation to those.
Absolutely. And we sometimes, and the public sometimes look at offences where people are young and they're very violent, and the courts will take into account their age or take into account that they've attempted to do some courses or something like that, and it can seem trite or a bit unfair, really. But the opposite is also true, that if people just keep coming before the courts, get out of prison and immediately reoffend, eventually the justice system really tires of them and starts giving them very, very lengthy sentences for what can seem like lesser crimes, for sure.
Right, well, I'm sure we haven't heard the end of Scott Kapper, but for the moment we'll leave it there. Thanks, Niall. If you are already a subscriber to crimeworld.com, you've probably binged on our 6-part deep dive into the life and the rise of the dapper Don Christy Kinahan. From the streets of Dublin to the head of a global cartel, what made and moulded the ambitious Kinahan? And where is he now as he runs from the law? For those of you who haven't joined us yet, here's a short extract from our exclusive series, which is just a click away. So we're going to do a rest here. We're going to start this tome, which is the sort of the life and crimes of Christy Kinahan Sr., who has to be the most fascinating individual in the entire sort of Kinahan cartel set. You know, he is an intriguing character, to say the least.
I think he's the most interesting of all the gangland criminals, really, if you see where he's come from and where he's ended up and how he's managed to navigate through all of those eras of organised crime. An incredible story. If he was involved in another arena of life, he'd be regarded as a kind of heroic businessman. But of course he's not. He's involved in a murderous cartel. But an incredible story.
And there's a little bit of intrigue and mystery to his background, which we're going to go into. Some of it is clear, and other bits, the stories that go around the mix, and you can never, like, for example, you know, some people would say he was a heroin addict. I know he did tell the courts at one point that he did, but he did it for a reason. And the reason was he wanted a free education.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very interesting, the heroin addict, and maybe we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to it, because that is something that, you know, certainly some people close to him say that was never the case.
Yeah.
And those who are sort of, I suppose, become his enemies in more recent times would definitely say that, like it's a
stick to beat him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's other little bits that are unusual. We'll start and we'll go through as much as we know factually, and then we'll also discuss the rumours. So he's born in 1957. He's 6 years older than Jerry the Monk Hutch, which just gives him a little bit of a, you know, we can see where he is. He's what I would always say was into the bosom of a respectable middle-class family. Now, some intrigue comes with this. His father, to my understanding, was a taxi driver who worked the Gresham rank on Stephen's Green. And that would have been a good job.
That would have been a good job, a well-earning job. Certainly taxis, back in the day when taxis were protected. His father was also at some point registered, or went, I think, on as a dairy farm manager, and also people would say he was involved in kind of street trading. Not, you know, as a lot of people in Dublin would have been over the years, involved in some stalls and selling in that sort of arena. So Christy Kinahan is raised in Cabra, but his birth cert says that he was born in England, in a place called Perryvale, near Ealing, I think, in London. So this is the late 1950s, when at that time in Irish history, we were, you know, there was high unemployment. A huge number of people left Ireland to go to England at times to get work. Many of them returned, but that would have been one of the big points of emigration, where young couples got married and went over there. Certainly Christy Kinahan wasn't raised in England, but he certainly does seem to have lived there at times. He's had connections to Birmingham and that sort of area, maybe all his life. So he's described, I suppose, as having a middle class upbringing.
Well, I suppose the first house that we can look upon that we know he was in as a child, and he was the only boy in a family of three girls, Denise, Maria and Sally Ann. The mother appears to run a B&B from what is a generous Edwardian house. Do you know the name of the road?
Charleville Road.
Charleville Road.
So, I mean, yeah, I know it well. I mean, I would have grown up very close to there. I mean, those houses are worth a huge amount of money. Now, like a lot of houses in that area, for example, those big houses on the North Circular Road, which aren't far away, there probably would have been times where you would have picked them up at a bargain price, but it would be at, you know, very, very far away from some of the figures we've discussed. For example, the grinding poverty in which Jerry Hutch would have been born into. Certainly Christy Kinahan would have been raised in something that's now worth a huge amount of money, that home. And it's
would they have always been a middle class sort of a home? We're using that term very loosely here.
I you know, that's part of East Cabra.
Yeah.
Right now, if you walk through East Cabra now, you can't. There's organic coffee shops and all of that sort of stuff, and houses being sold for routinely close to $500,000. Like back in the 60s, it wouldn't have been so much like that, I think. And those houses, like a lot of places in sort of Stony Batter or somewhere like that, those houses wouldn't have been seen as posh houses.
Would a taxi driver's wage have bought that house?
Well, it would have. It would have. I mean, it would be far, far bigger than most houses in that area, and would have cost a lot of money. But I suppose it's a different context, and Cabra would have been different then. Christy Kinahan would have been growing up in the 60s, early 70s when he's a teenager, and Cabra at that stage would have been a lot kind of wilder, I suppose. Like a lot of areas, there was a lot of homes built at one stage, and young people grew up, and it certainly would be a far more settled area, just like places like Crumlin and Drimnagh have become far more settled as the time has gone on. So he would have been brought up in an area that I wouldn't describe as being a sort of upper middle class area. He would have been grown up in a working class area, in a big house in a working class area, really.
And it's a big house.
Yeah.
It's an impressive looking house. It always would have been. We do have some suggestion that the family originally lived in St. Teresa's Gardens.
Yeah.
To go from St. Teresa's Gardens to Cabra and to this Edwardian period property is a huge leap.
It is a huge leap, and people would have said to me, for example, that the connection between the Kavanagh and the Kinahan family, for example, has always been a bit.
Bomber Kavanagh's parents.
Bomber Kavanagh's parents would have known Christy Kinahan's dad. They would have been friendly. All those people have no involvement in crime. There's no suggestion of that, but that it would have been, I suppose, maybe not as straightforward as this is he's a middle class guy. It's somewhere along that line, I suppose. And like most Irish people have, the poverty is only one generation away, I suppose.
Well, he certainly had aspirations, and he was very smart. In school. Though it is said, and it just shows you when somebody gets as big a news story as Christy Kinahan that his leaving cert results have been made public. Do you know that? Didn't know that.
And maybe not made public, but the Sun did a story about how he actually failed his leaving.
Right.
So Christy Kinahan, look, there's no doubt about him being smart, but certainly that was said that he only passed 2 subjects. He would have gone to, it said went to Declan's in Cabra first and got expelled, and then went to O'Connell's in the North Inner City. Now, O'Connell's Christian Brothers School, probably one of the most famous schools in Dublin. My own father would have gone there. People would have got a scholarship, and it would have seemed to have been a really prestigious school. Past pupils would have included James Joyce, Pat Kenny, the broadcaster, former Taoiseach Sean Lamass, PJ Mara. Also, interestingly, and probably a relative contemporary of Christy Kinahan would have been Tony Gregory would have gone there, who would play a huge prominent role in the anti-drugs marches in the city. So he would have gone. He would have, again, that would have been sort of a prestigious school. But he seems to have not thrived. And then I think we get into a bit of a grey area when he leaves school.
But he excelled, apparently, at sport and at kickboxing.
Yes, and that was a thing that he kept up, I think, through all his life, one way or another. And obviously his sons would have a huge interest in boxing as well.
If you liked what you just heard, go to crimeworld.com now and subscribe for more ad-free listening, exclusive content, and the best crime stories around.